Hi, I'm Maea. Thank you guys all for being here. Thank you, Roski School of Arts. I've had the privilege of knowing many cohorts that have moved through this space and been in community with a lot of folks here. And so I'm really honored to get to share my practice and share my time with you guys here today. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm a multidisciplinary artist whose work is based in performance and sound. I feel at this moment that I'm performing sculptor, so a lot of these works are kind of coming out of this space of performance intersecting with objects. My practice is deeply connected to labor, with more questions than answers at this point around the themes of my making and my research. I'm at a point in my art practice where I'm making these objects and artworks that are now pushing me and asking me to understand what it means to stir up these ideas and work more deeply within my world building and my community practice. So this is a really early object. Right now I really want to talk about thinking about my garden as material. So this is from the start of my garden, my apartment garden. Right now I'm in this place where I'm taking these concepts from my small personal practice and finding the ways in which they intersect into my community practice. And right now, from my small garden into thinking about making a garden at Markham Middle School for the 60th anniversary of the Watts Rebellion is something that's kind of on my mind. And I'm trying to find that bridge between the personal and the public. So garden as material. I like to think about somatic memory and the deep connection and history with land. That's really central to my work. It's about a shifting body. It's about my shifting body and the communities attached to the work, away from capitalism and back into a plant time body. So this remembrance through action is essential in these times of climate change, political turmoil, and technological evolutions. Right now I'm in a place of reconnection with these modes of cultivation, passage of time, and sustainability. So these are kind of just some early shots of my garden in 2020. I was coming out of labor. I was working as an artist assistant with artist Beatrice Cortez. We were welding. I was working with actually a lot of cohort from here at Roski. And this was the first moment where I had to kind of reconcile what it meant to be outside of a labor position. You know, I was so used to a 9-to-5. I'd worked in the film industry and so used to kind of building on these kind of time frames. This was the first time I was kind of reestablishing time in my body connected to plants. So here's some early shots of the garden space. So this is a work titled, untitled, Nephew, 2020. It's a portrait of my nephew, Johannan. And this figure I placed in the space. This was a show called All in Time, the larger exhibition. And it was a moment where I was actually, this sculpture was growing in my garden, and me and a friend and a mentor, Rafa Sparza, came and helped me break the concrete, and we unearthed the root of this. This was kind of a conversation I was having with myself about uprooting. I was thinking a lot about my family's own diaspora, coming to Los Angeles, LA, Long Beach in particular, being kind of our new island space where these two cultures for me had intersected. I brought this sculpture into the space, planted it there. This is a jasmine plant, and it was full of seed, and it began to rupture and slowly die and change. So those were having that material kind of move into the space, alchemize and change, being in the observation of what it took to uproot this being, the sculpture, and watching it change in front of me and in front of the people who were experiencing this space. Hello. Okay. So I also make a lot of this work thinking of it in performance or the intersection of performance. As a weaver, I will weave parts of my body and I'll move through my personal space, I'll move through my day. This kind of becomes a print or an archive of that moment in this building. And these are just kind of moments where just recognizing that. So the figure which I call future ancestors, a lot of these sculptures that I have, are actually a personification of seed. I create these abstract portraits of my family and community members I like to think of them as kind of multi-generational artworks because inside of a lot of these artworks are plant bodies that will eventually disintegrate, turn back into dust, and all that will be left are parts of the seed. These have been interesting ways of working. The poetics of it are really beautiful, and then there's the actual material and the practical. So what does that look like to install again, for these things to move? And as storytelling figures, in my mind, they're allowed that grace, right? They don't always have to be the same. They don't always have to live the same way. So this was, its first iteration is my nephew, Jaden, another nephew sculpture. We love the boys. It was first shown at City Too Hot, which is a group exhibition here in the Arts District. And then it went to Orange County Biennial, Pacific Gold, and eventually to Lisa, New York, where it was entered into a collection. This figure's transition and reshaped body was also this kind of maturing, this kind of growing legs. So there's always that sense of humor in the work for me too. It's like, watch this kid grow legs, watch him move through the world. And yeah, there's always kind of the tension of how they land in new spaces. And I enjoy that because then we're always kind of performing together. We have to remake together. And the reason why the seed is actually a really important part of the way I think of this work is, we are in a GMO times. So much of our relationship to land is lost, and we're one generation in my family away from an agricultural background. So this kind of somatic memory is still present in our bodies. We have a relationship to it, and before actually I started this garden practice, I would kill a houseplant like in a week, and many of my friends would do the same. And this was like a new moment to kind of reconcile, again, just like a relationship to plant, a relationship to land. Also, this kind of mode of working, placing these objects within the institution, within a museum space, we have to have a lot of conversations about contamination and preservation within the work. This is a work that I made for Made in LA. This work is somewhat of a self-portrait as well as a portrait of Xochiquetzal, which is the weaver goddess within the Aztec pantheon, going into the whirlpool of the Fa'a, which is the entry to Pulotu, which is the underworld of Samoa, the spirit world. So it's kind of these intersections of culture. Sometimes in my research, I'm finding the overlapping of these different mythologies that kind of tie all together. Weaving is kind of also that bridge for me. I think a lot about human history and how, as humans in all cultures and all backgrounds, we had weaving. We used weaving to carry our food, to carry our children, to carry our water. These are ways in which a lot of people relate to this work of weaving, and here in Los Angeles. And thinking about contamination, in particular with this piece, and bringing it in, I talked to the curators a lot about what it meant to have seed in that space. There's a lot of protection around collections, so the work would have to be fumigated or somewhat suffocated to make sure that there were no bugs or any critters. There was a lot of poetics in what it meant to sterilize what I saw as a brown female body before entering this institutional space. Those are conversations that I have with curators. Those are complicated conversations. We find ways in which the seed can still enter without chemicals. And again, through my research, it's also, I'm thinking of the border, I'm thinking of this history of crossing. The Bracero project, or how people were fumigated entering into the US. So these are all complex conversations, but also I'm still living in this kind of mythological rediscovery for myself, right? Okay. Just some weaving. Also, I like to think about these works right now at the stage they're at as kind of prototypes for a viable future us. These projects evolve. As these projects evolve, I've begun thinking about these objects and figures and how they can be in service to my community, water purification and access, wind power, plant generators for electricity can exist within the community, especially communities that are greatly affected by climate change and political changes. So this is a sculpture that I showed in 2024 at Jeffrey Deitch, and it was a show called All in Time. That was a showcase of 12 curators, and all of them were artists involved in the show. We talked a lot about what it meant to be making an exhibition with all brown artists, all Mexican American identifying, but also wanting to extract that language from our showcasing, right? Like, we're all LA people, and there's connective tissue that all brought us into the space. We all have different relationships to each other, but we're all relating to each other. And so kind of at the beginning conversations of this curation, the word landmarks came up. And for me, and different people embodied that in different ways with their sculptures and their works that they showed. And for me, landscape in Los Angeles that was beyond space was a lot about water access and the unhoused. So those were two things that I found very important to place in space, especially in a Los Angeles exhibition. And so a lot of my sculptures are also asking for a sense of performance. So in this figure seated in the front, she has her hand extended out. There's a coin slot, and you can put a coin in there. A fountain's also another space where we tend to throw a coin in, right? But that was a drinking fountain, so the thought was we wouldn't put our coins there. Maybe we'd give it to this figure in the front. And so there's this kind of tension between, just the complexities of where we want to wish into in our communities, right? Also about materiality. I also like to be in a place of real surrender with the material. Like, this was the first time I was using polyurethane foam for the figure seated in front. And that was just a choice based on like durability, like the mobility of it, how lightweight it was. But in actually taking it out of its form, some really fun things happened, or some things that I felt like made sense with what the figure represented to me. Its face flattened. So we had a really flat face, its fingertips fell off, and I thought a lot about how that was relating to my relationship with the unhoused, or our visibility of the unhoused, right? This way we just don't see and don't recognize. This work was also seated at the front of the gallery space in the windows, and was really kind of also in conversation with the bystander, like the passerby, the pedestrian, and really thinking about how people interact with that request, that request for change. Something I also really found important within that piece, the filtration system was still really rudimentary. It was sand, charcoal, stone, and the water was filtering over and over. I think a lot about our access to water within the city, who has access, who doesn't, how in other places of my family's places of origin, water access is actually extremely limited in certain ways in Samoa and in Mexico. Our relationship to it is so different here in the United States, and that's an almost invisible privilege. So also in thinking particularly about that show, this is my niece getting the form, being this form. But in thinking about that show in particular, we were thinking a lot about the infrastructures behind. Like, okay, that's forward facing, this is what we're showing and exhibiting in the space, but also how are we being kind of radical within our relationship to the gallery? So in that, our collective spoke about asking the gallery to actually donate part of their proceeds to a grant that we would collectively decide on where we would spend it. This was really early in, these first conversations were really early in what was going on in Gaza, and we wanted to be very supportive of Palestine. We wanted to show brown solidarity. These are moments to kind of really radicalize what our actions were behind the scenes as well as in the front. So we talked to the gallery, they agreed. We're in this place where we're actually figuring out where the donations are going now. and the gallery gave away half of their proceeds from sales in the show. The original thought was that we would actually have a grant formed out of it where in our future shows, those same artists could actually continue to add into this grant. So again, about infrastructure building within these systems, like the gallery system, there are standards, but they are all individual systems. You know, everyone's actually autonomous, even though it feels like maybe not. Maybe this is the way things always have to go. These are really radical ways, I think, of working in these institutional spaces and within these commercial spaces. I think there's something really powerful about collective action in those ways and creating new models of how we can move and enter in those spaces. So this is a project I did called Stargazer, and it was at the State Historic Park, and it was supported by land. And this was the first time this was back in 2023. This is the first time I got to use my weaving practice as a means to kind of create some community action and also make new models for labor within my work. And these are models that I've taken from mentors and artists that I've also worked within their practices. This was a project where around the state park is actually one of the origin spaces of the Los Angeles River. I grew up on the Los Angeles River in Long Beach, and it's a site of importance to me. It's where also, like, the part I grew up on is where it re-enters the Pacific Ocean. Around the State Historic Park, there is a lot of issues with housing. There's a lot of unhoused surrounding that park. When I was in initial conversations with the curators there, we were talking about housing vulnerability. We were talking about Los Angeles as this place where people, you know, being from here, but also understanding this relationship to Hollywood, and people come here to make their dreams come true. It's a really special place. Not everyone finds that thing, and so, you know, we have a lot of disparity in wealth. And so our kind of model that we were looking for at that moment was to support, through labor, support housing vulnerable youth or elders. We put up signs around the park. And we looked for youth. We also reached out to a lot of arts organizations that work with young folks and unhoused folks. And our call out, this was our kind of call out, little flyer. And we ended up working with Artworks LA, and they introduced us to two youth, Janira and Maea, and both of them actually helped me with a weaving practice. We built this 10-foot sculpture, wave sculpture, and it was a sound piece. It was a wind chime, so it actually like bounced in the it bounced in the wind, and the thought was that it was pointing to the North Star, Polaris. And through my practice with them, our structure for labor was $100 a day. We met at the state park. Food was always included, so lunch was always provided each day. We worked 3 days a week. We did that for 3 months. Whatever the result was, like there was like kind of the fantasy idea of this wave breaking through, right? The Los Angeles River refinding its space. Again, that was even before the fountain, so really just kind of thinking about water and access. With the young ladies, it was the first time I actually got to make this mapping system that I've been thinking a lot about within my work, like the palm as a way to map the city. So the palm has a really strong history in Los Angeles as an invasive species. It came over with the mission systems. And again, through the beautification of Hollywood, it became a really strong identifier of Los Angeles and our understanding of Los Angeles. It's also very related to the grass, so it kind of grows in either really pristine places or it can grow in a parking lot. It can grow on the sidewalk, and it'll just grow through the cracks. And with the young women, we would traverse the city, and the cool thing about inviting people into my practice, and especially a foraging practice, was I also invited in their questions and the complexity of their questions, like what does it mean to be taking from the city this way? What are, what permissions are we given? What are we allowed? Those are important things for me to consider. So we decided that this was like a palm care project. And so we would find palms that were smashed up against apartment buildings, were growing in strange places, and that's where we would forage from. Janira here, who is our friend with the glasses, was actually an avid Pokemon Go player. And so this was, they made a small zine that they actually sold at the opening of the wave. And this is how they made their map. So they played Pokemon Go while we traversed the city. And just kind of a fast forward, this is Janira me helping her move in her couch last week. She got permanent housing recently. She was coming out of a foster care system and a lot of other complications. One of my mentors, Beatrice Cortez, when we talked about community and participation in community, something they said to me that was really profound was, when you enter into these spaces and when you decide to do this kind of community work, you commit to showing up. You commit to still being there. And I'm not there for everything. I didn't help her get the housing, but I did help her move the couch. So much of my practice right now is really trying to find, I'm trying to find the legible place between the making and the community work. This is a project that I was working on with Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory. Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory last year had their first in-class programming for Los Padrinos Juvenile Hall. This was the first time artists were invited in through their program. I know Artworks LA and other different arts organizations have had the opportunity to go in, but we brought in Palm, and we were paired with different curriculum. My conversation was around manifest destiny in the palm and weaving. We talked a lot about how women-sustained communities, indigenous women-sustained communities during during the move west, colonization's move west. A lot of indigenous women actually pivoted what the basket's utility was and made them more commercially viable for settlers. So they would change the basket to be adorned with Victorian flowers to make it more viable. And again, this is also kind of a push away from their own sovereignty with land, boarding schools being built up. And so again, these students were also a part of that legacy of incarceration and male separation. Bringing the palm in was a challenge, but we actually were able to make baskets with the students. And these are still early intersections. So this is at Kilpatrick, which is in Malibu. We're not actually allowed to take photos, but this was a basket that was made with students in Los Padrinos, and they just all signed it because we weren't actually allowed to have any other record. These are some garden activations and some youth. I think it's really essential in the practice that I'm doing to, a child who grows a tomato will eat a tomato. I grew up in food deserts. I grew up in places where there wasn't a lot of access to healthy produce and things like that. So I'm very much in a place within my practice where even just making the basket, even having students touch plants is really a radical action to me. I'm trying to understand how to move that forward in my work. Also, these models of labor were first kind of before the land project. These models of labor were something I worked through with my family for a show All in Time, which happened at Murmurs here in Los Angeles. I invited my oldest brother and my mother to be co-workers with me, so collaborators. We also created a model of pay and labor. This was something that even early within the gallery moment of this exchange of weekly pay, the first payments were missed, and I I remember my mom actually kind of pausing me and being like, don't say anything. You're lucky that we're in the space. Like, we're getting to do a show. And I told my mom I'd worked so much in these industries where actually my labor was so invisible that I could never contest anything. Like, this really radical moment of being artist is actually my capacity to remind these spaces that labor is essential, that labor is actually what's necessary for the work to be made. This is also the first show that my mom exhibited her own work. So this was the central piece within the exhibition of her, which is also the Fa-Fa, which is the whirlpool into the underworld. Again, I actually didn't know that mythology until one of my mentors, Dan Tulapapa McCullen, who's a Samoan artist, revealed to her. So here's an image of my mom with the sculpture for the show. And then also in the center is a piece she made as her own exhibition. So she makes work that is, she makes these crowns here, which are called tuingas. They're a Samoan ceremonial crown that's used in ceremonial practices, worn by the princess of the village, which just really means like the woman who gets to be in these spaces of counsel and conversation. This also included a sound piece within my mom's exhibition, so a sound piece that was a collaboration between me and my brothers. It was a collection of these conversations we were having during that time. A lot of music kind of important to our childhood and to our lives, and just that intersection of these identities. This is in Palm Springs, collecting palm. So, this weaving practice actually started in 2020 as kind of a movement practice through the city. All of us were walking for the first times in a really long time in LA. I was moving through the city, and it was a very private public space, right? Like, we were all masked up, we were all social distance. Going throughout the city and actually cutting these palms created kind of an interesting dynamic of relating to folks, even at a distance. I usually had what I recognized as elder folks or immigrant folks who would kind of pause and say, like, what are you doing? Like, what is that? Why are you cutting that? Or they would say, oh, actually my grandmother is a weaver. Oh, my aunt actually makes baskets here. So this was like a really powerful way for me to kind of engage with community while also being in a social distance moment. And again, this is when I first started thinking about mapping with palm. This is a project I'm currently working on right now. For the last year, I've worked with the Noah Purefoy Foundation as a teaching artist. It's a project where we take middle schoolers within 15 minutes of the Watts Towers to Joshua Tree to see Noah's outdoor museum space. We take them to the actual Joshua Tree National Park, and then we make a sculpture with them. We introduce them to Noah's work. Through this project, I've learned a lot about Noah's practice myself, and particularly these sites. One of the last schools we attended was Markham Middle School, and there's a garden space that's there currently that's been under service since the pandemic. Been really kind of thinking again about how this sculptural practice can intersect into community. This also happens to be the 60th anniversary of the Watts Rebellion and the 60th anniversary of the Watts Community Center that Noah and two other artists started back in 1965. But yeah, really thinking about these access points I have as an artist in LA, the communities that I've been able to be a part of, also the funders that I've also found myself in community with, and these arts organizations, and really in trying to do things well in the world, kind of behaving badly and going and asking people for money, and using these relationships And these moments to kind of radically take up space, bless you, and do big work within the community. Again, this is in a really kind of early transition into that with my work. I imagine sculpture is coming out of all of this. I'm in that crux place where it's just starting, you know, and I'm making these proposals and I'm talking to principals, and I'm not of those worlds in a lot of ways. And so I'm really kind of like learning from the models of radical baddies that I've known in my history. And again, a lot of professors and people like now Bustamante, who's here today, and folks who have just been really radical in spaces, and artists of color who just blow my mind all the time in the ways they've used this. And I'm also trying to acknowledge that this is a privilege of access. So really using my privilege of access to bring things of service into my communities and to continue that work in that way. Back to the garden always. Yeah, so this is where I'm at right now with the work, and I'd love to hear some questions. I'd love to be in a bigger conversation about it, if that's okay. Okay.